The wind screamed past Nathaniel Frost's cabin at 70 miles per hour, hurling snow so thick he could barely see 15 feet through his window. Across the valley, he watched Isaiah Cross's chimney smoke falter, then disappear entirely into the white chaos, a death sentence in the 6th day of the blizzard of 76. Nathaniel's heat pit glowed steady beneath its wooden cover, the bricks radiating warmth that would last another 12 hours without a single piece of wood added. Before we go further, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you love forgotten frontier survival techniques, hit subscribe because tomorrow's story is just as unbelievable. The year was 1875, and the Rocky Mountain autumn had arrived early with a cold snap that surprised even experienced trappers. Nathaniel Frost and Thomas Whitmore had been trapping partners for 6 seasons, working the beaver streams in what would later become northern Wyoming. They knew the mountains, knew the weather patterns, and knew how to survive. But on the night of October 23, 1875, knowledge wasn't enough. Their cabin was standard frontier construction. Logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone fireplace that drew adequately, and a single room that served as living space, workshop, and storage. They had gone to sleep with a solid fire burning, the cabin warm enough that they didn't bother adding extra logs before turning in. The temperature outside was cold but not extreme, maybe 20 degrees. Survivable by any measure. Nathaniel woke at dawn to find the fire completely dead and Thomas unresponsive in his bedroll. The cabin temperature had dropped below freezing during the night. Thomas had been fighting a chest cold for 3 days, nothing serious by frontier standards, but the sustained cold exposure while sleeping had been too much for his weakened system. He had simply stopped breathing sometime in the early morning hours. Nathaniel tried everything he knew. He restarted the fire, wrapped Thomas in blankets, tried to warm him back to consciousness. Nothing worked. Thomas Whitmore died at age 34 because a fire went out during the night. The reality of what had happened settled on Nathaniel slowly. They hadn't been caught in a blizzard. They hadn't been attacked. They hadn't made any obvious mistakes. A routine night in a functioning cabin had killed his partner because frontier heating systems required constant attention, and sleeping men couldn't provide that attention. Nathaniel buried Thomas on a hillside overlooking their trap lines. He spent 3 days finishing the season's work alone, processing the remaining pelts and preparing to leave the mountains. But during those 3 days, something changed in how he thought about survival. Most mountain men accepted the risks. Cold killed people, fires went out, partners died. That was the nature of wilderness life. But Nathaniel couldn't accept it. Thomas hadn't died from bad luck or poor judgment. He had died from a fundamental flaw in how frontier cabins were heated. A flaw that seemed obvious now that Nathaniel was paying attention. Standard fireplaces consumed enormous amounts of wood but retained almost no heat. When the fire died, the cabin temperature dropped rapidly. Keeping a fire going all night meant waking every 2 to 3 hours to add fuel. Miss one feeding, and you risked exactly what had happened to Thomas. Nathaniel left the mountains in early November with a question that would obsess him for the next year. Was there a way to heat a cabin that didn't require constant attention? Could heat be stored somehow, held through the night, released slowly enough that a man could sleep without risking his life? He didn't have answers yet. But he had watched his partner die from cold in a cabin with a fireplace, and that contradiction wouldn't leave his mind. Nathaniel spent the winter of 1875 in a boarding house in Fort Laramie, and he couldn't stop thinking about fire. Other trappers drank and gambled and told stories. Nathaniel sat near the boarding house stove and watched how it worked. The iron body radiated heat long after the fire inside had dimmed. The metal absorbed thermal energy and released it slowly. It was more efficient than an open fireplace, but it still required feeding every few hours. He started asking questions that made people think he was strange. How long did different materials hold heat? Why did stone fireplaces lose warmth so quickly? What happened to all the heat that went up the chimney? Most people had no answers. Heat was heat. Fire was fire. You burned wood, you stayed warm. That was the extent of frontier thermal engineering. But Nathaniel had watched Thomas die, and he couldn't accept simple answers anymore. He began visiting every building in Fort Laramie, studying how they were heated. The saloon had a massive stone fireplace that looked impressive but provided uneven warmth. The general store used 2 iron stoves that worked adequately but consumed wood at an alarming rate. The blacksmith's forge held heat in its brick interior long after the fire had been dampened for the night. That last observation stuck with Nathaniel. Brick held heat. He had noticed it before, but never considered why it mattered. The blacksmith explained that fire bricks were made from special clay, denser than regular brick, designed specifically to withstand and retain high temperatures. When the forge was banked for the night, those bricks stayed hot for hours, radiating warmth into the shop. Nathaniel asked if brick could be used for heating a cabin. The blacksmith shrugged. Brick was heavy, expensive to transport, and required mortar work that most trappers didn't know how to do. It was easier to just build a stone fireplace and accept that you'd burn a lot of wood. But Nathaniel was thinking about thermal mass, though he didn't know that term. He was thinking about materials that could absorb heat during active burning and release it slowly afterward. Materials that could store warmth the way a water barrel stored water. He spent January and February observing cabin fires throughout Fort Laramie. He noted when fires were started, how often they were fed, how quickly rooms cooled when fires died. He talked to families who had lost members to cold exposure. The stories were depressingly similar. Someone got sick, weakened, couldn't maintain body heat during the night when the fire burned low. Or a traveler got caught between shelters, built a fire, fell asleep, and froze when the fire went out. The common factor was always the same. Fire provided heat only while actively burning. Standard construction retained almost none of that heat. The moment fuel stopped being consumed, temperatures dropped rapidly. Nathaniel realized he was trying to solve 2 problems simultaneously. First, how to store heat so it would last through the night. Second, how to release that stored heat slowly and steadily without requiring constant attention. Standard fireplaces solved neither problem. They converted wood into heat and immediately lost most of that heat up the chimney or through inadequate insulation. By March, Nathaniel had a basic concept forming. He needed a heat source that could be loaded once and burned slowly. He needed that heat source surrounded by material that would absorb thermal energy. And he needed the entire system enclosed so heat couldn't escape rapidly into the air. He had no idea if it would work, but he knew he had to try. In April of 1876, Nathaniel traveled to a trading post 40 miles south of Fort Laramie. The post was run by Ruth Brennan, a widow who had moved west with her husband in 1872. Her husband had died during their first winter, kicked by a mule and unable to recover from internal injuries. Ruth had stayed, turning their small cabin into a successful trading operation, serving trappers and travelers moving through the territory. Nathaniel had been to Ruth's post twice before, but this time he paid attention to something he had previously ignored. Her cabin was warm, not just adequately heated, but genuinely comfortable even though the morning air outside was cold enough to freeze water in buckets. And she wasn't constantly feeding her fire. Ruth noticed his attention and asked what he was looking for. Nathaniel explained about Thomas, about his winter spent studying heat, about his belief that there had to be a better way to keep a cabin warm. Ruth listened, then walked him over to her heating system. Her husband had been a mason before moving west. He had built their cabin's heating system using techniques from Pennsylvania, where he had learned his trade. The fireplace wasn't a standard open design. It incorporated a brick chamber behind the fire opening with channels that directed hot air through brick passages before venting outside. The bricks absorbed heat during burning and radiated it for hours afterward. Ruth demonstrated by letting her morning fire burn down to coals, then closing the damper partially. The bricks continued radiating warmth. She explained that she typically fired the system twice daily, morning and evening. The thermal mass carried the cabin through the periods between firings. Nathaniel asked if he could examine the construction. Ruth agreed. He spent 3 hours studying how the bricks were laid, how the mortar joints were finished, how the air channels were designed. The system was sophisticated, far beyond what he could build alone in the mountains. but the principle was clear. Brick absorbed and stored thermal energy. Mass mattered. The more brick surrounding the fire, the more heat could be retained. Ruth showed him her supply of bricks, extras her husband had brought west but never used. She offered to sell them. Nathaniel bought 40 bricks, paying more than he wanted to spend, but knowing he needed them. He also bought 2 bags of dry mortar mix and asked Ruth to teach him basic masonry technique. She spent the afternoon showing him how to mix mortar to proper consistency, how to lay brick with joints that wouldn't crack, how to think about thermal expansion and contraction. Her husband had taught her the basics, and she had maintained the system herself for 3 years. When Nathaniel left the next morning, he carried 40 bricks, mortar supplies, and knowledge that no other mountain man in the region possessed. Other trappers at the post saw his loaded pack animals and asked what he was doing. Nathaniel said he was building a better fireplace. They laughed and wished him luck with his heavy, useless cargo. Nathaniel returned to the mountains in May of 1876 and selected a new location for his cabin. The spot was higher than most trappers preferred, on a ridge with good drainage and sight lines. He built the cabin, structure first, using standard log construction, but with more care than usual. Tight-fitted logs, proper chinking, a solid roof. The shell took 3 weeks. Then he began the work that would make other trappers think he had lost his mind. He marked out a rectangular area in the center of the cabin floor, 4 feet long by 3 feet wide. Using a shovel and pickaxe, he dug down 2 feet into the packed earth. The excavation was precise, walls vertical, corners square. He lined the bottom with flat stones for drainage, then began laying brick. Jacob Hensley, a trapper whose camp was 6 miles east, stopped by during the 2nd week of construction. He watched Nathaniel laying bricks with mortar, building walls inside a hole in his cabin floor. Jacob asked what in God's name he was doing. Nathaniel explained he was building a heat storage system. Jacob laughed and said that fancy brickwork belonged in city houses, not mountain cabins. Real men just built bigger fires. Nathaniel didn't argue. He kept laying brick. The pit walls rose from the stone base in careful courses. Each brick was leveled, each joint checked for consistency. Nathaniel worked slowly, letting mortar cure between courses, building strength into every layer. The interior dimensions of the finished pit were 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 20 inches deep. The brick walls were 4 inches thick on all sides. He built the floor of the cabin around the pit, leaving the brick structure exposed like a rectangular well. Then he constructed a framework above it using iron grates he had purchased in Fort Laramie. The grates sat 6 inches above the brick pit floor, supported by iron brackets mortared into the brick walls. Below the grates, he created an ash collection area with a small iron door that allowed him to remove spent ash without disturbing the fire above. This door also served another purpose. By opening or closing it, he could control airflow from beneath the fire, regulating burn rate and temperature. Above the grates, he built a wooden cover frame from thick planks. The frame fit precisely over the pit opening and could be lifted off entirely or propped partially open. He cut vents into the cover, each with a sliding wooden panel that allowed him to adjust air intake from above. The entire construction took 5 weeks and used all 40 bricks, plus additional stones and ironwork. When finished, it looked like a rectangular brick box set into the cabin floor, topped with iron grates and a ventilated wooden cover. Jacob visited again and said it looked like a fancy root cellar. He asked when Nathaniel was going to build an actual fireplace. Nathaniel said he already had. Jacob shook his head and left, convinced his neighbor had wasted an entire summer on useless brickwork. The first test fire in early July was a failure. Nathaniel loaded the pit with pine kindling and logs, lit it, and watched as flames rose enthusiastically through the iron grates. The fire burned, hot and fast, consuming wood rapidly. Within 2 hours, everything had burned down to ash. The bricks were warm but not hot. The heat dissipated quickly. He had built a brick-lined fire pit, but he hadn't built a heat storage system. Nathaniel spent 3 days thinking about what had gone wrong. The problem was burn rate. pine burned too quickly, creating intense heat for a short period. The bricks didn't have time to absorb significant thermal energy before the fuel was consumed. He needed slower combustion, sustained heat over many hours, fuel that would burn steadily rather than explosively. He began experimenting with different wood types. Cottonwood burned slowly but produced minimal heat. Aspen was similar, lots of flame but little thermal energy. Cedar burned steadily but still too fast. Oak was better, denser wood that burned longer, but oak was scarce in the high country. Then he tried something different. Instead of starting with raw wood, he created charcoal first. He built a fire outside the cabin using pine and let it burn down to coals. He shoveled those coals into a covered metal container, starving them of oxygen. Over 6 hours, the wood transformed into charcoal, dense carbon that would burn much hotter and longer than raw timber. He loaded the heat pit with charcoal and lit it with minimal kindling. The difference was immediate. The charcoal burned steadily, producing consistent heat without flames shooting through the grates. The combustion was slower, controlled, efficient. And the bricks began absorbing serious thermal energy. Nathaniel monitored the temperature by holding his hand near the brick walls. After 2 hours, the bricks were hot enough that he couldn't keep his hand close for more than a few seconds. After 4 hours, the entire brick structure radiated significant heat. After 6 hours, when the charcoal had burned down to fine ash, the bricks were thoroughly saturated with thermal energy. Then he waited to see how long they would hold it. The bricks radiated heat for 14 hours after the fire went out completely. The cabin temperature remained comfortable through the entire night. When Nathaniel woke at dawn, the brick walls were still warm to the touch. The system had worked exactly as he had hoped. He spent the next month refining the technique. He learned that hardwood coals worked better than pine charcoal. He discovered that partially closing the ash door and top vents reduced airflow, making fuel last even longer. He found that loading the pit with coals in the evening and allowing slow combustion through the night produced the most consistent results. By August, he could load the pit once at sunset and maintain comfortable cabin temperature until late morning the next day. 18 hours of heat from a single loading, no waking during the night to feed fuel. No risk of the fire going out while he slept. Jacob Hensley visited again in September and admitted the cabin was remarkably warm, but he still called it overcomplicated foolishness. Autumn of 1876 arrived with unusually cold nights. By late September, temperatures were dropping below freezing regularly. Nathaniel's heat pit proved its worth during those early tests. He established a routine of loading coals each evening around sunset, adjusting the vents to maintain slow combustion, and waking to a warm cabin every morning. Other trappers in the region were already burning wood constantly, feeding their fireplaces every few hours to fight the cold. Nathaniel burned less than half the fuel they did and stayed warmer. The efficiency was remarkable, but he was the only one who understood why it mattered. In early October, Martin Kellerman stopped at Nathaniel's cabin during a supply run. Martin was a German immigrant who had been trapping for 3 years. He was methodical, careful, and curious about techniques that worked. When he entered Nathaniel's cabin, he immediately noticed the warmth and the unusual brick structure in the floor. Nathaniel explained the entire system. The brick thermal mass, the charcoal fuel, the airflow control, the overnight heat retention. Martin listened carefully, asked specific questions about construction methods, and examined the brickwork closely. Unlike Jacob Hensley, Martin didn't laugh. He asked if he could watch the system operate through one complete cycle. Nathaniel agreed. Martin stayed through the evening, watching as Nathaniel loaded the pit with hardwood coals, adjusted the vents, and closed the wooden cover partially. They sat talking as the cabin remained comfortable without any additional fuel being added. Martin checked the time repeatedly using his pocket watch, noting how many hours passed with no attention needed. At dawn, Martin felt the brick walls and found them still radiating significant heat. He asked how much wood Nathaniel consumed in a typical week. When Nathaniel told him, Martin calculated that it was roughly 1/3 what he himself was burning. The efficiency advantage was undeniable. Martin asked if Nathaniel would help him build a similar system. Nathaniel said he would share everything he knew, but Martin would need to obtain bricks and learn basic masonry. The construction wasn't simple, but it wasn't impossible either. Martin left with detailed notes and plans to travel to Fort Laramie for supplies before winter closed the high passes. Word of the heat pit spread through casual conversation. Trappers meeting at supply points heard about Frost's brick heating system. Most dismissed it as too much work. A few were intrigued but doubted it would survive a real winter test. The general attitude was wait and see whether the fancy construction would actually matter when temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. Jacob Hensley remained the most vocal skeptic. He told other trappers that Nathaniel had wasted an entire summer building something that a good stone fireplace could accomplish. He said, "Real mountain men didn't need brickwork and mortar to stay warm. They just needed adequate firewood and the sense to keep their fires going." By late October, snow was falling regularly. Winter was coming early and hard. The real test was approaching. The first major storm hit on October 19, 1876. Snow began falling at midday and continued without pause for 3 days. Temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Wind created drifts that buried anything less than 4 feet tall. It was the kind of storm that typically arrived in December, not mid-autumn, and it caught many trappers unprepared. Nathaniel loaded his heat pit on the evening of the 19th and settled in to wait out the storm. He added coals once each evening, maintaining the same routine he had established during September. The cabin stayed warm. The brick thermal mass radiated steady heat regardless of the wind howling outside. He slept through entire nights without waking to tend the fire. Jacob Hensley was less fortunate. His cabin was solid construction with a good stone fireplace, but the extreme cold and wind created conditions his heating system couldn't match. The fireplace required constant feeding. Every 2 to 3 hours, Jacob had to add wood to keep flames going. Miss a feeding, and the cabin temperature dropped rapidly. On the second night of the storm, exhausted from lack of sleep and constant fire tending, Jacob let his fire burn too low. He woke at dawn on the 21st shivering violently, the cabin temperature well below freezing. His woodpile was inside, but his hands were so cold he could barely grip the logs to restart the fire. He managed to get flames going again, but the experience terrified him. In desperation, he did something mountain men rarely did. He abandoned his cabin during a blizzard and traveled the 6 miles to Nathaniel's location. The journey in waist-deep snow nearly killed him, but he arrived at Nathaniel's door in late morning, half frozen and exhausted. Nathaniel brought him inside. The cabin was warm enough that Jacob could feel his fingers and toes tingling as circulation returned. He stared at the heat pit, still radiating warmth from coals that had been loaded 16 hours earlier. No active flames, no constant attention, just steady thermal energy stored in brick and released slowly into the space. Jacob said nothing for a long time. Then he asked if Nathaniel would teach him how to build one. Nathaniel said he would, but not until spring. Building with mortar in winter temperatures was impossible. The mortar would freeze before curing. Jacob would have to survive this winter using his existing fireplace, but he could build a proper heat pit before the next cold season. Jacob stayed 2 days, waiting for the storm to break. During that time, he watched how little attention the heat pit required. 1 loading per day, minor vent adjustments. That was all. No constant fire feeding, no waking every few hours, no risk of freezing if exhaustion caused him to sleep too deeply. When the storm cleared on October 22nd, Jacob returned to his cabin. He told other trappers what he had seen. Some believed him, others thought he was exaggerating. But the story of how Frost's heat pit had operated through 3 days of blizzard conditions without constant attention began spreading through the mountains. November of 1876 brought unseasonably warm weather. Temperatures rose into the 40s during the day, melting much of the October snow. Trappers who had been worried about early winter relaxed. Some said the October storm had been an anomaly, that the real winter would be mild. Nathaniel didn't believe it. The warm spell felt wrong, like pressure building before something broke. On November 24th, the temperature dropped 30 degrees in 4 hours. By sunset, it was below zero. By midnight, it had reached 20 below. And then the snow started. The blizzard of 76 began as heavy, wet flakes that quickly turned to fine, wind-driven ice crystals. Visibility dropped to nothing. The wind built steadily through the night, reaching speeds that made the cabin walls creak. By dawn on the 25th, the storm had reached full intensity. Snow fell so thick that Nathaniel couldn't see 10 feet from his window. He loaded his heat pit and closed the vents to maintain slow combustion. The bricks absorbed heat and radiated it into the cabin. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the temperature remained comfortable. He had adequate food supplies, enough charcoal and firewood to last weeks, and a heating system that required minimal attention. He was prepared to wait out however long the storm lasted. From his window, when visibility occasionally improved, Nathaniel could see smoke from chimneys at other cabins in the valley. Isaiah Cross's cabin was 2 miles northeast, visible from Nathaniel's ridge on clear days. Isaiah was 71 years, old, a veteran trapper who had survived 4 decades in the mountains. His cabin had a standard fireplace that Nathaniel had seen during visits the previous summer. For 3 days, Nathaniel could see Isaiah's chimney smoke rising intermittently through breaks in the blowing snow. The smoke told him Isaiah was alive, maintaining his fire, fighting the cold. But on the morning of the 28th, during a brief moment of visibility, Nathaniel saw Isaiah's chimney produce no smoke at all. He watched for 2 hours. Nothing. Either Isaiah had let his fire go out, or something had happened that prevented him from maintaining it. At 71, in temperatures approaching 40 below zero with wind chill, a dead fire meant death within hours. Nathaniel made a decision that was either brave or insane. He loaded a pack with blankets, dried meat, and a container of hot coals from his heat pit. He dressed in every layer he owned and started toward Isaiah's cabin through the blizzard. The 2-mile journey took 3 hours. He navigated by landmarks he could barely see, following a creek drainage that he knew led to Isaiah's location. The wind threatened to knock him down repeatedly. Snow accumulated on his clothing faster than he could brush it off. But he kept moving. When he reached Isaiah's cabin, the door was frozen shut. He kicked it open and found Isaiah unconscious on the floor near a dead fireplace, the cabin temperature well below freezing. Isaiah was alive, but hypothermic. His skin was cold to the touch, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak. Nathaniel wrapped him in the blankets he had brought, then assessed the situation. Isaiah's fireplace was full of ash but no live coals. His woodpile was depleted to a few frozen logs. The old man had simply run out of fuel and lacked the strength to go outside for more during the blizzard. Nathaniel couldn't restart the fireplace. The chimney was packed with snow driven down by the wind. Attempting to light a fire would fill the cabin with smoke. He had only one option: get Isaiah back to his own cabin where the heat pit could save him. Moving an unconscious man 2 miles through a blizzard should have been impossible. Nathaniel rigged a travois using blankets and 2 lodge poles he found in Isaiah's cabin. He strapped the old man onto it and began dragging him through the snow. The journey back took 5 hours. Nathaniel fell repeatedly, lost his bearings twice, and nearly gave up when the travois caught on buried rocks. But he kept pulling. When he finally reached his cabin, both men were on the edge of collapse. Nathaniel dragged Isaiah inside and closed the door against the wind. The heat pit was still radiating warmth. The cabin temperature was comfortable, perhaps 65 degrees. The contrast with the deadly cold outside was shocking. Nathaniel stripped Isaiah's frozen clothing and wrapped him in dry blankets near the brick structure. The radiant heat from the bricks began warming Isaiah's core temperature slowly. Too fast would be dangerous, but the steady thermal output from the pit was perfect for gradual rewarming. Nathaniel forced warm water between Isaiah's lips, then collapsed beside the heat pit himself. They stayed that way through the night. Isaiah remained unconscious, but his breathing improved. His skin regained color. The hypothermia reversed slowly under the constant warmth radiating from the bricks. Nathaniel woke every few hours to check on him and add small amounts of fuel to maintain the pit's temperature. Isaiah finally regained consciousness on the morning of the 29th. He was weak, confused, but alive. He asked where he was. Nathaniel explained what had happened. Isaiah stared at the brick heat pit and said it had saved his life. Without it, Nathaniel couldn't have kept them both alive during the recovery period. The blizzard continued through December 2nd. 6 full days of sustained wind, snow, and temperatures that never rose above zero. During that time, Nathaniel's heat pit operated with 1 loading per day. No constant fire tending, no risk of the heat source failing while both men slept. The bricks absorbed thermal energy during active combustion and released it steadily for 18 to 20 hours afterward. Isaiah recovered slowly. By the time the storm broke, he could walk and speak normally. He owed his life to Nathaniel's decision to attempt a rescue, but he knew the rescue would have been pointless without the heat pit that kept them both alive afterward. When the blizzard finally ended on December 3, 1876, the survivors began assessing the damage. 12 trappers in the northern Rocky Mountain region had died during the 6-day storm. Some froze when their fires went out. Others died attempting to gather firewood in conditions that made travel suicidal. One man burned to death when his desperate attempts to keep a fire going resulted in his cabin catching fire with him trapped inside. Isaiah Frost survived only because Nathaniel Frost had built a heating system that didn't require constant attention. The story spread quickly through the scattered trapping community. By spring of 1877, trappers traveling through the region made specific trips to see Nathaniel's heat pit and learn how it was constructed. Martin Kellerman built the second brick heat pit in May of 1877. He had purchased supplies before winter and had survived the blizzard by maintaining his fireplace continuously for 6 days straight. He said he never wanted to experience that exhaustion again. His pit was operational by July, built following Nathaniel's specifications, but with minor modifications based on available materials. Jacob Hensley built the third pit in June. He no longer called it foolish brickwork. He called it the reason he would survive the next major winter storm. By autumn of 1877, 5 trappers in the region had built brick-lined heat pits using variations of Nathaniel's design. The technique spread organically. Men who built pits taught others. Travelers saw the systems and carried descriptions to distant camps. Trading posts began stocking bricks and mortar for trappers who wanted to build heat storage systems. The name that stuck was Frost Pits, after Nathaniel. Though he never claimed ownership of the innovation or attempted to profit from it, Nathaniel continued trapping through 1881. By then, brick heat pits had become common in remote cabins throughout the northern Rockies. The construction time and material cost were still significant, but men who had experienced serious cold knew the investment was worthwhile. Several trappers credited their survival during subsequent harsh winters specifically to heat pits that allowed them to sleep without maintaining constant fires. In 1882, Nathaniel left the mountains permanently. He married a school teacher in Laramie and purchased a small ranch in northeastern Wyoming. He raised cattle, started a family, and lived a quiet life far from the wilderness that had nearly killed him and his partner years earlier. Isaiah Frost died peacefully in 1889 at age 84, having survived 13 additional winters after the blizzard of '76. He told anyone who would listen that Nathaniel Frost's brick pit had given him those extra years. In 1903, homesteaders discovered Nathaniel's original cabin on the ridge where he had built it 27 years earlier. The log walls had weathered but remained standing. Inside, the brick heat pit was still intact, mortar joints solid, structure sound. One homesteader cleaned it out and used it to heat the cabin through the following winter. It worked perfectly, radiating stored heat, just as Nathaniel had designed it to do decades before.